Hello and welcome to Creation or Evolution, Catholicism and the Question of Origins. Last time we spoke a little bit about our understanding of how to interpret Scripture, especially the book of Genesis and the creation account, contrasted kind of a middle view, a progressive creationist view with young earth creationism on the one hand, theistic evolution on the other hand, and the difference between the contemporary understanding of scriptural interpretation versus the more traditional literal and historical interpretation. Today we want to talk specifically about some of the scientific critiques of evolutionary theory. Oftentimes the narrative is that evolution is an established fact, that it's settled science, to put quotes on that. But in reality, there are actually challenges to evolutionary theory and its validity and its explanatory power from a number of branches of science. So today we're here again speaking with Father Michael Chaberek. Yeah, let's begin maybe with just some of the general challenges to evolutionary theory from the science.
Yeah, first should probably notify our listeners that I'm not a scientist in terms of natural science. I'm not a biologist. You are neither. So what we are going to present is a kind of, on one hand, is scientific arguments that we derive from scientific literature wrote by biologists, and we refer for scientific details to them. So we want to show that theologian may acquire a basic knowledge of science that helps him to kind of navigate this debate. So I don't have to be a biologist to actually get to know and understand basic arguments. Right. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that there are also some kind of common sense problems with biological macroevolution, as we defined it. So we are talking about biological macroevolution as a problem. And you don't really need to be a biologist who specializes in some very narrow field to see problems with a kind of broader picture, like logical problems, methodological problems, the problems of imbalance between the scientific and religious knowledge, and so on. So I would just make aware our audience that I may not be qualified to speak directly about some scientific details, but those details are really irrelevant to the main argument that I'm going to present.
Mm-hmm. And we can refer them as well to some of the works that we'll be citing from. And those books are written by highly credentialed scientists, bona fide experts in their field. So it's not as though the books that we're reading are written by theologians or amateurs who decided to play around with scientific ideas. They're written by legitimate experts in their fields of science. Okay, good. That's a good disclaimer to open with. Beginning there, what maybe are some of the more common sense arguments against the evolutionary theory?
Yeah, you always hear that similarity between species or forms of life point to their common descent. Right. So you see a similar structure in different, let's say, animal limbs. So you take fin of a whale, you take a leg of a horse, a human hand, a wing of a bat, and you look into a skeleton, a structure, bone structure of it. They always have like one main joint in the beginning, one main bone, then there is another joint, two bones, and then you have several smaller bones connected with little joints. And the common understanding among those who believe in universal common ancestry is that, well, this structure is presented in this particular species because it originated some time ago and then it kind of diversified or accommodated to these different environments. So that's why you have this structure. But if you look into this argument from a kind of common sense perspective, like, first of all, this kind of explanation does not explain the origin of the structure. It actually begs the question, because you have to ask, so where this structure came in this first organism that acquired it and how it acquired it. It only explains, actually it doesn't explain anything, it only tells you that this thing was present in one original organism and then it diversified, but it doesn't explain how it originated in the first place. So I would say it's a common sense question, That's not an explanation. But another thing that I'm not convinced by this argument because it actually confuses two things, I would say. Similarity which we see, with common descent or kinship, which we do not see. So the assumption is that the more the things are similar, the closer the kinship.
Right.
And this argument is also made on a genetic level. So they say 99% of human and someone on, let's say, chimpanzee genome is the same. Well, the claim itself is questionable, but even if it was so, is it true that similarity always points to common ancestry or kinship? I can find many examples where it doesn't. And the most obvious would be, let's say, you have siblings, let's say they are twins, one egg twins, so they are identical, so-called identical twins, let's say. But you have also like two eggs twins, so they are not identical, but the kinship between is exactly the same. But then let's imagine that the two siblings that are two egg siblings, they are not identical. They may actually differ quite a lot, including that one can be a girl, another a boy. So let's say they walk down the street, but there is another man, let's say these are two men, but not very similar, and there is another man who is a kind of alter ego, you know, the guy who could cover for this one in job, for example. So it happens that you have two people who are almost identical, yes? So then one of these, the stranger is much more similar to this one man than his sibling, which means that a guy who is unrelated or has very distant relationship is actually much more similar. Right. So we clearly see that more similarity doesn't mean closer kinship in this case. But I would even extend this idea and ask, well, if we take, let's say, a spoon, let's say we have a steel spoon and we have, let's say, a human hand, okay? Well, in my hand, there is about 60% of carbon and less than 1% of iron. An insignificant amount of iron. There are some atoms of iron. In the spoon, you have probably 95% of iron and a few percent of carbon. Does it mean that there is a few percent biological kinship between my hand and the spoon? Like, I don't think so. And another example could be a cloud, which consists 99% of water. Then you have a watermelon that consists 99% is water, and then we can say jellyfish that is 95% water. So all of them have 95% similarity in water. Nobody would claim that, I don't know, clouds descended from jellyfish or any of these.
They all descended from one common ancestor.
Yeah, in biological terms. So people would say, yeah, but they share common ancestry in the sense that these elements were produced in the stars and maybe, but that's metaphorical common ancestry. You take it metaphorically. Whereas in biological macroevolution, you think about ancestry in completely literal way, which means that literally this animal is an ancestor of this animal, and ultimately you share common ancestor with a frog or a spider, literally speaking. Frog and a spider is your cousin, not metaphorically, but literally, because you could trace the generations to the common parent between us. So that's completely different story than saying in a metaphorical way that we all come from dusts of stars or some universal matter or something like that. So I don't think that there is really a strong argument from homology. It doesn't explain the origin of the structure. It doesn't really, there is what we call categorical mistake. So you replace one category with another. So in this case, similarity with kinship, and that's not justified logically speaking, as these are completely different categories. So
just to be clear, by homology, you mean the idea that when we find similar structures, similar features in different species, homology says that similarity then establishes kinship, or near kinship the more similar they are, and which of course then is one of the fundamental tenets of Darwinian and the Neo-Darwinian evolution, is this universal common ancestry. So but you're making a point there that I just want to highlight, and because this is a point that has kind of run through our discussion already, and that is there's a significant and very important difference between what we actually observe scientifically and what we conclude from what we observe. So we observe similarity. Yeah, that's similar, very similar structure in the fin of the whale, the leg of the horse, the arm of the man, but that means kinship. That means universal common. That's not an observation. That's a conclusion drawn from what we, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
And also similarities were observed throughout history. It's not that Darwin came and saw that there is a similarity of structure in these different limbs. That's not what he came up with. That was completely obvious for Aristotle and ancient observers of nature. However, they explained it in a different way. So similarity points to common design, not to common ancestry. And common design in this case is that you need one big joint that attaches your limb to your body, because then you get some kind of maneuverability. The movement is, so if you imagine a hand being attached to your body on the others, like the other way around.
At
like
the wrist.
At the wrist.
Or the fingers.
Basically. Yeah. You have no movement here, and you have no possibility to grasp any object with your other side of your hand, which basically means that there is an idea how to produce a hand or a limb, and this general structure then is adapted to many different applications, because this general structure happens to be efficient in fulfilling a task. In this case, it's probably moving the body through some mean, like walking or through water or through air by wings. So it's efficient. That's why a designer would use this structure many times. We see the same thing among human engineers. You don't invent a wheel each time when you build another vehicle, you know. And actually planes and bicycles and automobiles, they all have wheels, but they were invented sometime in the beginning of civilization, and then they were applied to different applications. They are modified each time, but the core idea is the same. And you can imagine moving an object on tracks, maybe on some legs, but it happens that wheel is the most efficient way. That's why you actually see wheels in most cases. Another example would be an architect. Like, we can ask, how would you introduce light into a building? And good idea is to have a window, which is like a hole in your wall that is filled with glass, generally speaking. So that's an idea, that's a solution. How would you introduce light to your building? You put a window, the framed glass in the hall. But then you adapt this solution to different buildings. Different windows as a church, a home, an office, a school. All kinds of buildings will have different type of windows. You adapt them. So this is the idea. So I would say that a much better explanation is actually this classic explanation. We see similarities because there is a common function. So this is common design. There is a need for such a structure to fulfill this kind of task. And the same is true in micro level, like genetic similarity. Why would apes and humans share so many similar or the same genes? Well, because we are biologically similar. We have very similar blood, we have similar respiratory system and circulatory system and skin, digestion, many physical activities of our bodies are very similar, so we need similar proteins. In order to get similar proteins, you need similar genes, so it's not, but it doesn't tell you that it is common ancestry, it's common design. Why would God invent completely new genes, completely new proteins to build pretty much the same organism or very similar organisms to perform very similar tasks? Actually, this is how we judge the contrivance of our engineers, whether they can use as much as it is there already, or they have to create so many new parts that the design becomes less efficient, actually, you know. So I would say it's a very smart of designing things rather than common ancestry.
Yeah, okay, good point. So the similarity seems to be better explained by common design than by common descent. Exactly. Okay, I like that. Good. What some other examples? There's some other common sense challenges or problems with evolution. Yeah, well, homology being one of them. But.
Yeah, I would say that there is also kind of logical problem with the idea of missing links, so-called, because the claim across the conversation, so I mean both creationists and evolutionists would say that, well, creationists would say there are no missing links, therefore evolution is not true. Evolutionists would say, well, actually we find those links very often, and if we don't find, we will find them in the future, or maybe they were not preserved in the fossil record, that's why we don't find them. So Darwin actually said that, yes, there are many missing links, but we will find them in the future, okay? That was his solution. I think that the very idea of links does not really help, because imagine you have three forms, let's say A, B, and C. And you can impose by your mind some kind of progression in size, in color, in efficiency, in temperature, whatever. So you can order them according to, let's say, the size. Yes, you have a small animal, larger animal, the biggest animal. The fact that there is this progression doesn't mean that one evolved into another. You can explain it very well that they have separate origin. So then even if you had, then you have to ask, okay, so we have three, but there is something missing between, the two, between A and B and C, you still have some kind of hole. So you have to fill it in with some missing form. So you find another missing form, but then you ask, well, okay, so now we have five. It still it's not a proof that one evolved into another, because still they may have separate origin, like God could have created five things, that you can order in some kind of progression. So then you have to fill in those gaps, and this goes ad infinitum. It's an infinite task. So basically, to prove that one evolved into another, it doesn't help how many links you find. So what I say typically is, all links are missing. It's not that there are missing links. All links are missing because every link may be considered a species or a link, because every species is also a link. That's an entirely philosophical problem, because if you really believe in transformation of species, you cannot even claim that there are any species, because how would you distinguish between an intermediate form and the true species? So if you have them all in one chain, right, beginning with species A, ending with species C, what would decide which of them is actually the true species? Mm-hmm. There is no criterion, because any intermediate form could be considered, because the distance between them is not there is no substantial difference between a missing link or the link or a final form. So I would say that this is logically not quite coherent to say that if we find links, then we prove evolution of one link into another.
Yeah. So there again, even if you could observe the links, allegedly links between different species, you would have to extrapolate from what you observe that these are in fact transitional forms moving from creature A to creature B and then on to creature C. There's nothing about observing those forms that establishes that that is in fact a transition from A to B to C. So there again, we have something you could at least in theory observe, but you don't observe the conclusion, you draw the conclusion. And to be honest, if you're approaching that project scientifically with the evolutionary mindset firmly in place, I believe that macroevolution, as Darwin described it, is in fact the way we got biodiversity. It would be hard to resist the temptation to see a creature that's neither A nor B as a transition. See, there we go. He's a transition.
Except for the fact that if you really look into fossil record, it doesn't show you smooth transitions.
Yes, this was my next question. Good job,
okay,
Father.
Okay.
You arrived before I did. Yes.
Yeah, because we know that there are two features of fossil record that were known to Darwin already. The species just pop out of nothing. They just simply appear in a fossil record in a fully grown form as they are, and then they last for millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of years. So if you have this kind of evidence, paleontological evidence, I mean, you may try to fit into a theory of the tree of life, but I think it's actually a positive evidence against the tree of life. Right. Because if you really see those explosions of species, there is nothing, then you have Cambrian explosions, so you get all types, all phyla in very short geological period, below probably 5 million years or something. So this is very rapid expansion of diversity of life, and you see it with everything, with mammals, with birds, with fish, with plants. So if Darwinian tree of life were true, why wouldn't you find normally support to this tree of life, and occasionally you would miss a piece, you know?
Right.
What we see is actually the opposite. Normally you see rapid explosion, rapid appearance, and occasionally you can find some branches of the tree that are disconnected with the tree, but you imagine that these are the branches. So, well, another point to make is that very often those chains of supposed evolutionary forms, they really exist, but if you look into fossil record, they don't exist in this chronology. They don't appear in the sequence they show you. So that's another thing that you kind of have to pay attention to, whether they actually appear in this kind of order in fossil record. So yeah, but for me as a philosopher, the basic are the logical question and methodological questions, like why would you discard other than scientific knowledge from all this picture, Why would you assume a paradigm that evolutionary theory of life has to be true? I mean, you can assume it if you are an atheist, you have to assume it, you have no choice. But if you are a theist, you have a choice, basically. You may assume the theistic evolutionary perspective with the tree of life in the background, or you can adopt kind of creationist position with the special creation of species in the background, yes? And then you, with this kind of open mind, you try to see which story matches the evidence better.
And it was interesting, you noted Darwin was perfectly aware of these huge gaps and these sudden explosions in the fossil record. He knew the fossil record in his time was actually a real challenge, and a purely scientific challenge. I mean, you talk about philosophically your options there, but even if you leave philosophy entirely to the side, Darwin was very well aware that scientifically this was a huge problem, and he was very honest about that. He said, unless and until we can find these transitional forms in the fossil record, this makes my theory very difficult to move forward with. They should be there. We have not found them yet. And so you point out the Cambrian explosion, that is the sudden appearance in the geological record of all the basic animal body plans. And again, from there, microevolution, which is non-controversial, takes over, and over time they vary a little bit within species, but you don't get whole new body plans. They're just variations on those themes. But then there's also, as you said, many other, the Cambrian explosion I think is the most famous, but there's all the sudden appearance in the fossil record of flowering plants, of birds, of insects, of on and on and on. Okay, so speak a little bit to the reality that what you have Darwin and then his followers, his disciples, those who take up his theory and carry it forward. Speak a little bit then to the reality that essentially when they're saying at the moment what we can observe scientifically does not support our theory and is even a pretty significant challenge to it, but for the sake of our theory, we believe that in the future science will find what's missing. Science will eventually help us out. Has that turned out to be the case? Was there faith in, and I use the word faith intentionally there, was there faith in the future explanatory power of science justified? Did it turn out that time helped them?
No, well, in the case of fossil record, it didn't, and I would refer here to Stephen Mayer's book, Darwin's Doubt, which clearly shows the case. So I think anyone who approaches the problem with an open mind would agree that paleontology made the problem even worse. But I would point here to one more problem, given the mechanism. So I think we should distinguish between two things: the mechanism, how evolution is supposed to happen, from the expected effect. So the expected effect is the diversity of species, whereas the mechanism proposed by Darwin was random variation / natural selection. So random variation under natural selection will produce the variation of species. Now, the mechanism, as we know today, is not very efficient in producing any biological novelty. So Neo-Darwinian mechanism fails. Now, it seems like if there is no mechanism that could produce the effect, we should abandon the effect. We should give up on the effect. Rather, it seems that people are very attached to the effect. So the production of diversity of species, they don't really care about the process, the cause that would produce this effect. And when the mechanism has been challenged, now it's been a few decades pretty much. In 2008, there was this Altenberg 16 meeting when 16 biologists met and discussed Neo-Darwinism, and they came to conclusion that we need to look for another explanation for evolution. Then there was this famous conference of Royal Society in London. It was in 2016 when over 100 scientists met. They were all biologists, and they questioned the Neo-Darwinian explanation for evolution. And again, they didn't find any better mechanism or process that would explain the effect. So it seems like if you don't find the effect, you should drop if you don't find the cause, you should drop the effect. However, it seems like people are attached to the conclusion more than to the kind of premises, right? And well, that's why I say that it's more of a philosophical claim, because you adopted the idea of universal common ancestry and then you try to justify it. And that's precisely what Darwin was trying to do. He adopted the idea of the tree of life, and then he wants to justify it no matter what. And whether the justification works or not, we stick to this so-called theory. So that's a problem. I think that's a kind of logical problem again, because, I mean, theoretically it's possible to stick to the effect, but if you don't find the cause, then it's definitely not scientific. If you don't scientific cause, it's not a scientific explanation.
Yeah, now you're doing philosophy. You're not doing science. That's interesting, because what you're pointing out there is the strange reality that a scientific hypothesis, which has a mechanism that it's proposing, it's going to be natural selection, working on random variation, and then the Neo-Darwinian, once the science of genetics is discovered, they say largely working on genetic mutation at the level of genes. But at any rate, the natural selection, working on these variations over very long periods of time.
And by the way,
please.
Natural selection is presented as a cause, as I said, as a cause, but if you think about it, natural selection is not a cause, it's an effect itself, because natural selection means that those things that are unfit, whatever it means, die out. Those that are fittest survive. But this is a fact, this is not the cause. Yeah, sorry for interrupting, but... Yeah,
right, it's a good point. Mm-hmm. What strikes me about that description is when the proposed or hypothesized mechanism fails, And again, the Neo-Darwinian mechanism has failed on a number of levels. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those as we move forward. But when that mechanism has really failed, but you're determined philosophically to hold on to the conclusion that this is a tree of life, this is just a matter of biodiversity springing from natural causes, it's a strange willingness on the part of scientists to leave that conclusion suspended on nothing. It doesn't rest on it. There's nothing to hold that conclusion in place anymore. But they hold it in place kind of artificially, and then work on creating a new narrative to support it. And this, to your point, those meetings of very, very high-ranking scientists, and not Catholics motivated by trying to get us back to the book of Genesis, but most of them very secular scientists. Just the fact that they're meeting to discuss what might be another workable hypothesis to support that conclusion tells you already that they are recognizing that the Neo-Darwinian mechanism has just failed. We need a new hypothesis.
Yeah. So many of them, I mean, atheistic, especially atheistic biologists would, at the end of the day, they would agree that that's a paradigm, okay? Since God doesn't exist, there is no supernatural, the explanation must be natural. And natural explanation must involve common ancestry, the tree of life, because you can't even imagine it otherwise. I mean, you could imagine scenarios like species randomly produced by natural causes from scratch, but that's kind of ineffective way. You would have to wait billions of years for production of any species. But so typically they would accept the tree of life as kind of paradigm. And I actually heard it from some biologists directly that after all, it's a paradigm. It's an assumption which we approach science in order to prove the assumption, which is kind of circular reasoning, I would say. You assume what you want to prove. Yes. And the same is true with with this homology and kinship. You assume homology in order to prove kinship, and the other way around. You assume kinship to see the homology. So this kind of circular reasoning, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's take a minute. I want to look specifically at some of the other scientific challenges that have arisen to the Neo-Darwinian mechanism. And we should say, and of course, as we know, human beings are very creative. Intelligent human beings with expertise and a lot of knowledge and learning have an almost endless capacity to come up with potential explanations, plausible stories, imaginative narratives.
Why can't we imagine this or that?
That's right. That's right.
It's not the phrase that they use is, it's not unimaginable that this happens.
Right.
So it's very like the laxity of standard is staggering.
That's right. And so to that point, you and I sitting here recognizing the very, very significant, if not lethal, challenges to the Neo-Darwinian mechanism. We're not waiting for the scientific community which believes that macroevolution is real and explains biodiversity. We're not waiting for them to wave the white flag and say, we give up, back to Genesis we go, you were right all along. They'll come up with all kinds of new ideas and it'll take time to test it. Okay, so that being said, there are a group of challenges which were present and known in Darwin's time. And we've mentioned a few of those. But then there's a whole new group of challenges which arrive by way of subsequent discoveries in science. New and more sophisticated instrumentation allows us to see deeper into the physical nature of things, further out into the cosmos, et cetera. What were some of the ones that were known in Darwin's time? But now, what are some of the more recent ones that Darwin no way he could have known about these, and how are those, in some ways, even more serious challenges to his mechanism?
Very good point, and I think that on this point I would refer to the classic book by Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box. Right. This is specifically what he explains, that in Darwin's time, the cell was a black box, which means that we knew the input roughly, so that there are cells, that they feed on something, that they propagate, that they live, but nobody knew what is happening in the cell. So it was like a black box. And as Michael Behe explains, over decades, especially in the 1950s, we opened up the cell and we discovered a staggering complexity and machinery. So for Darwin, a cell was like we could say a blob of uniform, like a gel or a gelatin, you know, something that is uniform substance that has qualities such as living, you know, breathing, maybe propagating, you know, that's like a uniform kind of plasma that has these kind of qualities. But we know that it is actually a very sophisticated mechanism in a way. Now, I understand the critique. Some people would, some probably more like Catholic philosophers in classic sense would say that no living being is a mechanism. Well, I'm not reducing a living being to a mechanism. What I'm saying is that there are features that resemble mechanism, and some of the organs work clearly as a mechanism. For instance, my hand now acts as a lever, right? There is a muscle and there are joints, and there is this point of, how do you call it, attachment, yes? So that's a lever. So it clearly works like that, and we see many things like this that have mechanical features in living beings. And obviously, this is another level of challenge. You know, there is information, encoded information, genetic information, epigenetic information. There are tons of other things that are very hard to explain. But I would maybe, because this all of this can be kind of found in the literature, I would point out to another kind of more like maybe a little bit philosophical problem. When you take natural selection, so the process itself is designed, is set to work like you have variation, and then variation under selection will produce some novelty, okay? Well, that's the problem, that the more distant the posterity is from the parents, so the more change you get, the more probably it is deteriorating. So the farther you go, so the bigger the mutation, for example, large genetic mutations usually create what we call mutants, yes? So they are not viable. So they are eliminated by natural selection. So in fact, there is some kind of disproportion between natural selection and variation. The bigger, in order to get progress in evolution, you need big variation. But big variation is cancelled by natural selection. Right. Whereas the small variation that would be favored by natural selection is not making the progress, is not providing the material to progress, for progress. Yes? So this mechanism doesn't work either way, because if you have small variation, it is viable, but it doesn't generate the diversity you need to produce something new. And it may be favored by natural selection, but there is no novelty in. If you create something novel, big variation, then it is cancelled by, or removed by natural selection. So
yes. So one of the pieces of literature, and I'm terrible at citing my sources. It may be one of the books you referred to. When I was in high school, we did an experiment for a biology class where we bred fruit flies for a month, and then we charted their genetics. Okay, so I was interested to see that one of the examples of what you're talking about were done on fruit flies, where they tinkered with the genes at the embryonic stage and got major variation. So I just remember one of them was, instead of antennae, the fruit fly grew 2 legs out of its head. Well, of course, that's interesting that you're pretending that you're a random mutation. You're not. The scientists knew what they were manipulating. But what you got was a poor fruit fly with legs growing out of its head, which is a dead fruit fly. It can't move about in its environment. It can't find food. It can't mate. And so it's a dead fruit fly. Well, okay, congratulations.
Yeah.
We produced a useless.
So it's neither natural nor it does produce any viable. It's designed by a scientist to show some interesting mutations you can do, but it doesn't show anything that could possibly happen in nature. Well, another example would be those experiments when they take an embryo of a lizard and they, by genetically manipulating it, they deprive it of forelimbs or back limbs or all limbs. So you get a lizard without limbs. And some would claim that this is a snake. It has no limbs, it's a lizard without... Well, I would claim that this is a lizard without legs and it's not viable. And moreover, you don't produce any novelty again. Even in your case, you don't produce any novelty. There were antennas and there were wings and all parts were there. You just kind of rearranged them. And in this case, you deprived a lizard of its limbs, which means that you showed an example of devolved animal, not evolved, but so devolution, which is designed by a man, which is totally contrary to the assumptions, evolutionary assumptions, right? So all of these examples will show you either devolution or just things that are not viable or things that do not really produce any novelty. Yeah, so these are the limits of...
And you make another interesting point there, Father, which I just want to call the viewer's attention to, because it can sneak by unnoticed, but I want to pause and point to it. You make the point that in every single one of these cases where an experiment is being run to try to simulate what might happen if this gene mutated in this particular species, that simulation is itself intelligently ordered and designed from beginning to end. Scientists study and learn about this species. They look at the genome. They decide how they're going to manipulate the genes. They purchase the specimens. They put them in a carefully contrived environment so that they're healthy to run the experiment. They think through all the calculations of how the experiment will be run. They're tracking the data. They're building it into computer models that they've already written algorithms for. So in other words, at the end, not only do we have a useless animal, which if it's even survives to be born, it won't survive long, our legless lizard, our fruit fly with his legs sticking out of his head. But we got to that poor little misfire by way of a process which is intelligently manipulated and run from the very beginning. In other words, it's not simulating nature unguided, just things happening randomly.
There are some examples when they would put bacteria into flasks. So they would perform experiments in different flasks and they would feed bacteria with some, let's say, type of sugar that they did not digest before, but over many, many generations, there would be some genetic mutation that would, they would say create, but it does not create any capacity. It just breaks a gene in such a way that it can actually digest, let's say, a type of sugar or whatever. And in this sense, we could say this is what natural environment could do if there is very strong pressure, environmental pressure. But still, you don't get any significant novelty. You just broke one gene. And if you remove the very specific conditions, the population will actually return to its original variation because it's healthy. So the mutants are less healthy. That's why they die out when you remove some source of pressure on their population. So again, we are going back and forth. We are breaking genes. We are removing information from the animal. We are devolving them. This is all what Michael Behe says, that evolution is, what they call evolution is actually devolution in fact.
That's right. And furthermore, those changes are, to go back to a distinction we made in a previous conversation, those are micro-evolutionary changes. They're variations. That's still the same species of bacteria. It now has a modification with a broken gene that allows it to metabolize that particular type of sugar. Okay, great. So, Father, another one of these challenges is the whole question of genetic information, and in addition, epigenetic information. We talk about the information revolution with the internet, but there's a biological information revolution that has come along as well. Speak to that challenge a little bit.
Yeah, again, I would just draw on biologists, and I would say that there is always this idea that you can reduce an organism to a part of an organism. So if you get new genome, you will have a new species. That's not true. I mean, we know that it's not true. Because if you take the whole genome of one species and introduce to, let's say, an egg of another species, you will not have anything. It's gonna die because there is this incompatibility between the embryo and the genetic information, which kind of shows you that genetic information is not everything. You need what is typically called epigenetic information, which means information outside of genetic information. Scientists would point to several sources of such information, such as, let's say, structural information. So the shape of the embryo very often determines the way it will develop. And so the physical shape actually carries some kind of information. And you could probably split it into many other sources, but the point here is that any mechanism of evolution will always focus on a part of an organism, and by changing a part of an organism will try to change the whole organism. Yes, but it never works, because to use an analogy, to simplify a thing, if you change my hand, you can change my hand. By changing my hand, you will not change me into a different species. Right. So analogously, if you change a genome, you will not change an entire organism, you will change only the genome, and if it's not compatible with the rest, the organism will not survive, because then it is missing a very important portion of itself, which is its genetic information. So I would say that that's a big challenge, because in fact, no mechanism will kind of affect, no computable mechanism will affect the whole being. Yes, it will always affect some aspect of a being. That's why no mechanism will ever explain the origin of species.
Yeah, you can change features, but not create new creatures. There is an interesting. So speaking about epigenetic information, and again, science has done a fine job of, as it seeks to understand genetics better, DNA better. There were scientists that began to recognize, just doing their science, there's information here that is running this system, running this process of the development of an organism. And there's then a real question: can that information be reduced to simply material elements in this organism, or this portion of this organism? And what's become increasingly clear, which is rather fascinating, is that this information is not just information in a static sense, but it's specific information that's acting like an instruction manual. It's telling certain things to do certain things at certain times and not others, and in combination with other parts, but not other. And so an analogy that I heard that I thought was kind of helpful, and I want you to expand on this a little bit, was, many kids love to play with Lego. Mm-hmm. And so you buy the pirate ship set. Oh, that's neat. I want a Lego pirate ship. And you take it out of the box, you dump out the box, and there's 250 pieces, all different colors and sizes and shapes. And then there's an instruction manual. And the information in the instruction manual says, take this specific piece first, take this specific piece, attach it to this specific piece. Next, and eventually you've built the pirate ship. There was a plan, there was a goal, and then there was a very specific price. Now, you could take those Lego, throw away the instruction manual, and just start sticking pieces together. You would end up with something, maybe, but it wouldn't be the pirate ship.
If you think about something and you design it in your mind first, you come up with the idea, and then you put them together according to the idea that you have.
That's right.
It's almost like following the instruction that you dumped, but you have another idea in your mind.
That's right. You gave it a new set of instructions, and to use the English term, you repurposed those parts to make the thing that you planned. The evolutionary concept would be almost closer to you dump out the Legos, throw away the instruction manual, and then come back a billion years later and wait to see what the Legos did with them. Maybe that's a silly example, but okay.
No, I understand, and I think it's very true. It's an analogy, obviously, and I think that the problem here is that when you have so many choices in the first step, and then you have so many choices in the second step, and you have so many choices in the every next step, because you can attach the blocks very differently, the pieces can be attached in a very different way, and you can take different pieces, then it makes your there is a vast array of possibilities, but only very few of them will be, let's so-call it, functional. So there will be a ship or a car or a house, but those that are functional, that represent actually something like a house or a car, something that is intelligible, this is a very small fraction of all the possibilities you can get. So if you just start building it randomly, you will much more often get something that is completely useless rather than something that is representative. But I think it's a good topic that we can discuss when we'll be discussing intelligent design. Here I would just point to something, the problem of the so-called evolution simulations that we talked a little bit with the fruit fly, with lizards and other things. There is this idea that you can actually show on a computer evolution working randomly according to, let's say, natural selection, producing novelty. And I think that's, again, a little bit overrated because any of those programs actually have some information uploaded, so we could say front-loaded, so that you actually design a program in such a way to achieve a goal. So drawing on the analogy with Lego, Richard Dawkins came up with a program that apparently simulates evolution. So at each step, the program knows which element to fix in such a way that if you hit randomly in the first place, if you hit a proper element, then it is fixed in place. And then you go to the second stage and you again randomly pick the pieces, let's say amino acids or maybe nucleotides, nucleobases. And once you hit the proper one, you fix it. And so in this way, you can achieve by randomly, kind of shuffling through the combinatory space, you can get whatever you want. The problem is that you have to know ahead what you need to fix in the first place. So you need to have a plan, which means you need to see the goal, the end of this process before it comes. And this is where you hide the information. There is a goal-directedness in this process. It is embedded in the program. So I don't think it really represents random variation, natural selection in nature, as it is a blind process that has no goal. Evolution doesn't think, it doesn't see the goal.
So then, Father, maybe we'll end here. Speak a little bit about the discrepancy. Then we've talked about a lot of very serious, and to be clear, we've given just a very brief treatment to introduce some of these serious scientific challenges to the evolutionary hypothesis. There's much more to be said. Talk a little bit then about, even though these are long-standing challenges, very well-known challenges in academic circles and among experts, the discrepancy between the understanding of these challenges and then what still continues to be taught about evolution at the textbook level to students, what I learned, what I read in my textbooks growing up.
Yeah, and probably I read the same things. But actually, Jonathan Wells, one of the critics of, but he was a biologist and he passed away just a year ago. he coined a term icons of evolution. And by this he means those pictures, usually these are pictures that you have throughout textbooks basically, that supposedly prove evolution, biological macroevolution again. But what they actually show is either just some kind of variation or they are totally flawed, like Haeckel's embryo. That's a very funny argument from my perspective. As a philosopher, I don't see, like, they present different. Haeckel, so he was a scientist, so-called scientist in the 19th century, who made a drawing of embryos of different animals and different stages of their development.
Okay, meaning their embryonic development.
Embryonic development.
Yeah.
According to him, they are very similar in their look and in their progress. So they kind of go through the same stages in the development.
Do you remember, Father, what some of the animals were that he used?
I think chicken and rabbits, mostly mammals as far as I remember. But these drawings were basically imagined by him, so the drawings were not accurate. And now, today, we have actually photos of those embryos made under very good microscopes, so we see that they are clearly different. They are very different in the beginning, then at some stage of their development, they kind of come closer to each other, they are more similar, and then they diverge again into different forms and shapes. But the very core problem here is, why would you extrapolate from what we call ontogenesis, so the development of a being, to so-called phylogenesis, which is the supposed development of a species, of all phylum, of all branch of animals. I don't see connection here. I don't see a logical necessity that even if they are similar, and even if they went through similar stages, I don't see how would it point to common ancestry. I just don't see it logically speaking. Maybe someone can explain it to me, but I don't see it. But that's one icon. And these drawings of those, Haeckelian embryos from the 19th century, they've been reproduced hundreds and thousands of times.
So those still show up in textbooks?
I mean, I found it, after he published the book Icons of Evolution, I looked up Polish textbooks at the time, and they were still in high school textbooks. And he was actually surprised because in most American textbooks, this portion was actually removed. That doesn't happen often anymore. But there is this famous icon of, ape being transformed into human. You see it everywhere, or those pepper moths that supposedly evolved by changing colors, or those finches with different beaks. These are all icons of evolution, and they are kept reproduced, and they are still reproduced in different textbooks. And we clearly can tell that science, that's not science, this is more like iconography, Sure. Iconography, and we could say that we are iconoclasts in this sense, that we kind of destroy those icons, right? So yeah, so that's the problem between what is taught and what is commonly believed from cutting-edge science. And I agree that cutting-edge science does not have to be applied to education, but let's be honest, Darwinian mechanism has been challenged for 30 years or so, so maybe it's time to kind of slightly adjust our textbooks or understanding of the mechanism of evolution. So I would say that every culture needs something like specific concepts and the paradigms. And we live in times when the evolutionary paradigm is the paradigm for culture. Every culture has some story of origins, so some foundational myth. For ancients, these were incredible stories about gods and other creatures that, transformed one into another, and fights between gods producing universe, humans, and so on. So mythologies was the way how you explain things, the paradigm, the important questions in ancient times. Then when Christianity came, The paradigm was taken from the Bible, and the historical realism of the Bible was the paradigm. So we have creation story, and this is true story. Right. It's not a novel, it's not a myth, it's a true story. It's attached to history. It speaks about the real event. And a post-Christian culture is guided by science. So scientific language is the one that is convincing, that is, and science is the source of answer for most questions. People look for an answer in science, how to become happy, what's the meaning of life, and where the universe came from. Right. So the important questions are drawn from science. And that's why in textbooks you have mythology, you have paradigm, you have overarching story that supposedly helps you to understand reality. I think the kind of challenge is to compete with the Christian story with this story that we are taught.
Yeah, propose the Christian counter-narrative. I like that. Great. Well, Father Chaberek, thank you very much for being with us, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation in our next episode.
Thank you.
For a more in-depth look at all these fascinating topics, pick up a copy of Father Chaberek's excellent book, Creation or Evolution, A Catholic Dilemma, now available in a brand new English translation. The link to order your copy from Amazon or Barnes & Noble is in the show notes below.